As a screenwriter, what can we learn from Villeneuve's 2021 version of Frank Herbert's epic Dune? How's it? This is Chop and Screenplay Prep looking at a film called Dune, originally written in 1965 by the author Frank Herbert. It's had a couple of attempts to bring it to the screen. This is an epic book, much like the Tolkien books, and to bring it to the screen has always been a bit of a, not just hurdle, but a concern, particularly from diehard fans, as to whether the story could be given good justice. So naturally, when 1984's version done by David Lynch was released and it really didn't hit the mark, naturally anyone to follow in the footsteps was potentially going to be up for failure. However, special effects have come a long way, but I believe that it takes the right director and writers to bring a story like this to fruition and to do it justice. I believe Villeneuve has done that, and a friend of mine saw the film first and begged me to go and see it, selling it on terms of the score, the epicness, the cinematography, and great acting. Last week I saw it, and this week I saw it again because I wanted to get more of a feel for it to give you guys some sense of screenwriting and where this film potentially does well. That begs the argument, does good screenwriting bring a good movie? Not necessarily. However, with this 2021 installment of Dune, I believe the collaboration between Villeneuve, Jon Spaihts and Eric Roth as screenwriters, they've made a fantastic job. And where this is an adaptation, so this is the key thing, this is a book adaptation to film, the screenwriters do write by the original author and not take their story and completely bend it to their own needs. This is a sense of honor and honoring the original story. And this is particularly relevant for something like Dune, as much as it was also for the Tolkien movies. The perils of book adaptation to film is that you've already got an established fan base. Now, Frank Herbert wrote Dune back in the 1960s. It was published in 1965. So it's had many decades to garner a following. So you've got a lot of people with expectations, particularly that whoever takes upon the filmmaking, that they honor the story. So the screenwriting and filmmaking challenge for Dune is to please those hardcore fans as much as not alienate the new audience. And the greater number of people potentially on those cinema seats are that virgin audience who have never read the book. That is quite a feat to please both sides, because ultimately a book like Dune being so epic, Herbert went into such detail as to the populations in this epic universe that you could argue that it gets quite confusing and vast. And to present all of that as exposition at the beginning of a film could be too much. So Villeneuve luckily pulled back on that and met the fans essentially halfway. And as a screenwriter, it's important to remember that the cinema experience is very much a visual one. So when writing a movie such as Dune, you almost want to err more on the action description and provide the visuals to feed the director and cinematographer ultimately to create this beautiful imagery. And that's exactly what happened in this Villeneuve version. There are some stunning shots and scenes which just emphasize whether it's the epic size of the locations and the sets, or whether it's the dunes themselves, the spaceships, the planets. But you do have very much a visual feast. And I do believe as a screenwriter, you can very much lay the foundations and pave the way for the cinematographer to create that epicness. So it's all in your action description. In a movie like this, if you get too verbose, And in some ways, Frank Herbert's book in parts did have dialogue as much as monologues, which would otherwise be voiceovers. I think Villeneuve made a really good decision in pulling back on that. In a film that really impresses visually, you don't want to be looking at your screenwriting pages as being too dialogue heavy. So the year is 10191. This is quite far in the future. And in a way, this kind of allows for a fresh canvas. It's so far in the future, you can't really argue as to what's going to be possible or not, or what cycles of destruction mankind might have been through. So this presents a nice blank canvas for a screenwriter as much as a filmmaker. One of the aspects that really stuck out to me was the music score. Hans Zimmer is another genius of cinema. His music was employed beautifully, and this is a great example of where a music score far outstrips the typical use these days of pop songs and whatnot, whereby you have lyrics that could potentially interfere. I think often filmmakers think the lyrics of the song back up the emotions of what's happening on screen, but I find it personally that it creates almost like two visions. You know, you're watching what's happening, but then you've got another story happening in the music. Although one's supposed to complement the other, I don't find it works, and I'm afraid that a lot of TV dramas fall foul of this. Anyhow, Hans Zimmer's music is fantastic. Now, I bring this up because as a screenwriter, you can almost leave room for music. In the way you write, you can imply drama and emotion, and then the filmmaker, a good director, will pick up on that and realize that the music can really build up these scenes and bridge gaps. So I do believe you can leave room in your screenwriting. And that may sound confusing, but it's more that you're being cunning with the way you write, in that you imply that there could be a music track. Now, unless you're writing a musical movie, you don't really want to be pointing to specific bits of music. You don't want to be saying Beethoven's symphony number blah blah blah, enter here and end there. You don't point to music. It's usually because of rights for the music that a producer or an agent doesn't want to see that, oh, this movie is going to be expensive because we need to get the rights to this, and that. Classical music perhaps less so, but even still, you don't want to dictate what the music should be, but you can write in a way that the director will look and see that this just begs for a fantastic score to bolster, back up, and bridge the gaps and effectively help one scene translate into the next. You'll see here in the action description how words can be constructed in such a way that they infer music. This would not happen around dialogue, as that would just interfere. And you want the poignancy of music to marry with the visuals in such a way that you've got a bit of cinematic poetry. One thing that stuck out to me that could be managed at the screenwriting stage, but I wonder sometimes whether it's often the director does it, is character revelation. So we have Jason Momoa playing this character Duncan, and his entrance on screen is when his spaceship lands in the hangar, and all you see is this masked pilot step down, and then we have a wide shot of the silhouette of Duncan walking to a table to put down his helmet whilst he's talking to young Paul. And at the silhouette stage, you potentially might recognize who it is, but then we get closer for a two-shot of the two characters, and you go, oh wow, it's Jason Momoa. It's a kind of thing Hollywood likes. It's a kind of thing that's great for the revelation of an actor, more so than the character, I fear. But particularly if it is useful for a character, you can do this in the screenwriting stage, just as they wrote into this film, which is effectively that you have a character walks down off the shuttle, fully masked in his jumpsuit, paces over to a table and sets down his helmet against the backdrop of the light from outside. This pilot is Duncan. He turns to speak to Paul. Something like that is a great way of almost presenting a hero as well. It's a great announcement, and it's a bit of charades to provide a larger reveal, really, for your character. So that's something you can pick up on in Dune. A big component of screenwriting is with your story structure and what is the point of the film? What is the desire of the main character or characters? What do people want? And in this film, a lot of people want the same thing. Now, Herbert's book may well have gone into further intricacies of what goes on in his universe, but in this version, Villeneuve has opted to cut it back a little, and essentially everyone is after spice. So spice is this material that lays across on the sand dunes on this planet Arrakis. Harvesting spice is what everybody wants. Spice holds the key to riches in the universe. So this is quite clear in this film. That really sets the tone nicely and removes any confusion at that very basic level. So it's a good example of screenwriting where that's established pretty blatantly, I feel. I spoke in a previous video about repetition and not repeating events. So if an event happens, you show that and the audience sees the event, but then the cops come and the person in the scene recounts the event again to the cops, and then it goes to court, and then the lawyer has the witness recount the events yet again, such that the audience would be seeing that action and dialogue 3 times, and that's boredom. You can get away with it in a book, but when a movie is condensed to 2 to 3 hours, you don't want to be having a significant amount of that time with repetitive viewing. And what was quite cunning here is the visions that young Paul has. So he has a vision earlier on, but we don't see it in its entirety. And it's only later, when his mother, Jessica, asks about it, do we then jump to the visuals of it as Paul recounts it. So that's a cunning way of avoiding the repetition, but setting up that something happened earlier on, and then we get to witness it at a later stage. One of the big aspects to this version of the film is that in the original book by Herbert, there are many inner monologues. This would translate to potentially a lot of voiceover. And the 1984 version done by Lynch, unfortunately, didn't do so well. And one of those problems may have been the overabundance of voiceover. Effectively, these whispery scenes of characters with their mouths not moving and the voiceover talking about what might have been going on in people's minds and suspicion of others, etc., etc. The problem with that film is that it almost kind of got rendered to self-parody and really just didn't work. So Villeneuve decided not to do that. And one of the mechanisms he did use whereby it was potentially important to carry something across in the story was to create something that wasn't in the book, which was this hand signaling between Jessica and her son Paul. But it meant that without the need for voiceover, that they could communicate. And writing that in was a great way of getting over that hurdle. Again, this is probably relevant if you were looking at adapting a story yourself, but Herbert's book had a lot more dialogue for the evil Baron Harkonnen. So Stefan Skarsgård plays this villain, and apparently when seeing the script the first time, noted how little dialogue there was. However, Villeneuve justified this in stating that by reducing the dialogue, it really emphasizes the fear and the menacing aspect of the character of Harkonnen. He's quite a formidable figure in the film with the special effects, and those moments of action where Skarsgård is not speaking are pretty powerful, and he really does come across as someone you wouldn't want to want to mess with. When you're screenwriting, you want to look at sometimes holding back with your nemesis and simply emphasizing the presence and describing how they might be standing, what action they might be going through that would impose themselves on screen. And you win much more with less. So in your screenwriting, you want to consider, particularly with the nemesis, that holding back is a good thing. Allowing more for the visuals rather than the dialogue can often be way more powerful. It depends on your character and the situations, but generally the presence, that visual imposing character, can deliver way more of a fear factor than someone who rabbits on, let's say. One of the more powerful moments in the film was when Baron Harkonnen leaned over the Duke as he's lying there naked in the chair, paralyzed by the potion and the dart. And Harkonnen talks about what he's going to do, who's going to suffer and whatnot. And we know, because he's paralyzed, the Duke can't answer. So how do you convey the emotion? Well, it's pretty simple, and Villeneuve did it. The camera just goes in a little closer. A tear falls down the Duke's face. And in writing that begs for a close-up. So you don't need to say close-up or anything like that. If you write a tear rolls down the Duke's cheek as its own shot, which is effectively declaring a fresh paragraph, that's enough to say, okay, camera, get in close, because we need to see this tear coming down this guy's face. And the power of that is fantastic, because we realize that the Duke is conscious and hearing this beratement from Baron Harkonnen. It's a very powerful scene that brings the anticipation of what we know that the Duke is going to do, because the doctor had given him this back tooth that he can crunch down on to hopefully bring the demise of Baron Harkonnen. I don't want this to become an epic video like Dune, so maybe there'll be a sequel, but I hope that was useful to look at something topical and see how it fits in with screenwriting, and that when you watch something in the cinema, you can be mindful of the writing approach to the production of the movie. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video. If you found that video useful, please consider liking and subscribing. That will tell YouTube that I'm worth watching and ensures I can produce more educational content into the future.